The city you live in right now could be one of them. There is a map of Britain that almost no one is talking about. On the surface, it looks completely normal. The coastline, the cities you've heard of, maybe even your own town. But when you switch on one particular layer, something terrifying happens. Great patches of the map turn blue. And that blue is water. The sea flooding inland, swallowing whole cities, not in some distant science fiction future. By the year 2050. Within the lifetime of almost everyone watching this video. And here is the unsettling question I want you to keep in your mind for the next few minutes. Is your city on this map? Because the places we're about to walk through are not tiny, forgotten villages on the edge of nowhere. They are some of the biggest, busiest, most familiar cities in Britain. Places where millions of us live, work, and grew up. Stay with me to the end and you'll find out whether the city you call home is one of the ones the water is coming for. According to climate scientists, this is not a wild guess. It is a projection based on the sea levels we are now on course for. And it shows something that should stop you in your tracks, that some of Britain's biggest, oldest, most important cities are sitting directly in the path of the rising sea. Cities where hundreds of thousands of people live and work right now. There is a major English city where the majority of the land already sits below the level of the sea, held back only by walls and pumps. There is a city built entirely on an island, packed with people, with nowhere to escape to when the water comes. And there is the capital itself, London, protected from catastrophe by a single aging barrier that has to be raised more and more often, and that will not hold forever. And this is not really about the year 2050 as a deadline. It's about a process that has already begun. The sea has been creeping up for decades. The floods are coming more often. The defences are being tested harder every single year. 2050 is simply the point by which the scientists say the danger becomes impossible to ignore. This is the story of the British cities that could be lost to the water. This is Gone by 2050. Before we dive in, do one quick thing. If you find these disappearing corners of Britain as gripping as we do, hit that subscribe button now. It's free. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it means you'll never miss one of these journeys. Go on. Subscribe, and let's look at the cities the sea is coming for. And there is only one place to begin, with the British city that is already living below the waves. The city is Kingston upon Hull, Hull on the east coast of Yorkshire, at the mouth of the great Humber estuary. It is home to 250,000 people, and it holds a distinction that almost no one outside the region realises. Hull is, by some measures, the most flood-threatened city in the entire United Kingdom, outside of London itself. The reason is brutally simple. The vast majority of Hull, around 90% of the city, sits below the high tide line of the sea. Let that sink in. 9 out of every 10 homes, streets, schools and shops in this city are, right now, lower than the sea that sits just beyond the walls. The only things keeping Hull dry are its flood defences and its drainage. A constant, unseen battle of walls, banks and pumps against the water pressing in from the Humber and the North Sea on one side, and the rain and rivers on the other. And Hull already knows what happens when that battle is lost. In the summer of 2007, after days of torrential rain overwhelmed the drainage, the city flooded catastrophically. Around 8,500 homes were swamped. Thousands of families were driven out, many of them living in caravans and upstairs rooms for months, some for more than a year, while their ruined houses were dried out and rebuilt. One man died. It was one of the worst urban floods in modern British history. And there is a bitter irony in it, because Hull is a proud, resilient city that has fought its whole existence to stay dry. A place that later celebrated being named UK City of Culture, even as it quietly reinforced the walls holding back the Humber. That 2007 flood was, in a sense, only a preview. Because as the sea level rises through this century, the water Hull is holding back gets higher, the defences have to work harder, and the margin for error gets thinner and thinner. Hull is the front line. It is the city that shows us right now what it means to live below the sea, and what it will mean for many more places if the water keeps rising. And just to the south of Hull lies something even more astonishing, an enormous stretch of England that shouldn't really be dry land at all. They are called the Fens, a vast, flat, low-lying region spreading across Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire and Norfolk, and taking in towns and cities like Peterborough, King's Lynn and Boston. And here is the extraordinary truth about the Fens. Much of this land lies below sea level. It was once a great watery marsh, and over the centuries it was drained deliberately by armies of engineers who dug channels and built banks and installed pumps to turn the swamp into some of the richest farmland in the country. But that land has never stopped wanting to be water. The entire region is kept dry only by a colossal, never-ending effort. A network of drainage channels and pumping stations that must run constantly, forever, just to keep the sea and the rivers out. If those pumps were ever switched off, huge areas of the Fens would simply flood and return to marsh within weeks. Now add rising sea levels to that fragile system. The town of Boston, the city of Peterborough, the port of King's Lynn, and the whole Lincolnshire coast around Skegness, all of it is flagged in the flood maps of 2050 as being at severe and growing risk. An entire slice of eastern England, home to hundreds of thousands of people, living on borrowed land that the sea has never truly given up. And where that low coast meets the North Sea, there are towns holding the line by their fingertips. Take Great Yarmouth on the Norfolk coast, a low-lying town wedged between the sea and the marshes of the Broads, much of it barely above sea level, and heavily reliant on its defences to keep the North Sea out. Or the long, flat Lincolnshire coast, where seaside towns like Skegness sit behind banks and walls with the sea on one side and drained, below sea level farmland on the other, meaning the water threatens them from in front and behind at once. These are the places where, in a bad storm surge, the difference between a normal day and a disaster is measured in a few inches of tide and the strength of a sea wall. In the Great North Sea flood of 1953, before modern defences, a storm surge swept down this coast and killed hundreds of people in a single night across eastern England. The defences are far better now, but the sea is rising to meet them, and every year the margin gets smaller, and this coast has already seen the nightmare with its own eyes. On the night of the 31st of January 1953, a monstrous storm surge, a wall of seawater driven by a savage storm and a high tide, came roaring down the North Sea and slammed into the east coast of Britain. There was almost no warning. The sea smashed through the defences and poured inland in the dark into sleeping towns and villages all along the coast of Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. People woke to freezing water rising up the walls of their bedrooms. More than 300 people in England were drowned that night, and tens of thousands were driven from their homes. Across the sea in the Netherlands, the same surge killed nearly 2,000 more. It remains one of the worst natural disasters in modern British history. It was that catastrophe that shocked the country into building the modern sea defences, and eventually the Thames barrier itself. But here is the sobering thought. The surge of 1953 struck a coast where the sea was lower than it is today, and lower than it will be tomorrow. The defences have improved. The sea has been rising to meet them ever since. And if you think 1953 is ancient history, think again, because it came terrifyingly close to happening all over again in living memory. In December 2013, the largest storm surge to hit the east coast since that terrible night came barreling down the North Sea. This time there were warnings, and the modern defences mostly held, but only just. The sea poured over the top in places from Yorkshire down to Kent. In the historic town of Boston in Lincolnshire, the water breached the defences and flooded hundreds of homes in the middle of the night. Along the Humber near Hull, the surge sent water surging over the banks. In Great Yarmouth, thousands of people were evacuated from their homes as the authorities braced for the sea to break through. In the end, the walls mostly did their job, and disaster was largely averted. But it was a desperately narrow escape. It was proof, in our own decade, that the threat is not some far-off computer projection. The sea is testing these defences hard, right now, and it is climbing higher every year. But rising water isn't only a problem for the flat, open coast. Some of Britain's most crowded cities are dangerously exposed. And one of them has a problem no sea wall can solve. The city is Portsmouth, on the south coast of England. And it is unlike anywhere else in the country. Portsmouth is the only city in Britain built almost entirely on an island. It sits on low, flat Portsea Island, packed with people. One of the most densely populated places in the whole of the UK, and that is exactly what makes it so frightening. Because Portsmouth is low-lying, much of it barely above the level of the sea, and it is surrounded by water on almost every side. The land is even thought to be slowly sinking. When the sea rises, a city like Hull can in theory retreat inland, but Portsmouth is an island. There is no higher ground to move to. There is nowhere to go. Tens of thousands of homes on Portsea Island are already at risk of coastal flooding, and as the sea creeps up through this century, the water closes in from all directions at once. Portsmouth is a city that could, in the worst projections, find itself fighting simply to remain above the waves, an island city slowly being cornered by the sea. Quick pause, and if you're finding this as eye-opening as we do, take 1 second to hit subscribe. We put a huge amount of work into digging up these stories about Britain's disappearing and threatened places. And subscribing is completely free and helps us more than you can imagine. Right, back to it, because the next threat comes from one of the most powerful tides on the entire planet. Over on the other side of the country, the danger takes a different form, driven by one of the most powerful tides on Earth. The Severn Estuary, on the border of England and Wales, has the second highest tidal range of anywhere in the world. The water can rise and fall by as much as 14 metres between low and high tide, and two great cities sit right on it. On the Welsh side is Cardiff, the capital of Wales, much of it built on low reclaimed ground close to the water. On the English side is Bristol, with its historic docks and low-lying districts strung along the tidal river Avon. Flood modelling has repeatedly flagged both cities as being among the most at risk in Britain from that combination of a rising sea and an enormous tide. In the worst-case maps of 2050 and beyond, great swathes of Cardiff and Bristol turn blue. The very city centres, the docks, the neighbourhoods where hundreds of thousands of people live, shown underwater at the reach of the highest tides. And history warns us this is real. Back in 1607, a catastrophic flood, possibly a storm surge, possibly even a tsunami, swept up the Severn and drowned huge areas along both shores, killing thousands. The tide that did it then is still there. It is only rising. And between those two cities lies a place that shows just how real the danger is. Around Newport in South Wales stretch the Gwent levels, a broad expanse of reclaimed, below sea level marshland, drained and protected behind a long sea wall on the edge of the Severn. It was here, more than anywhere, that the great flood of 1607 struck hardest. A marker on a church wall in the area still records how high the water rose that day, well above head height, showing exactly how far inland the sea reached and how deep it stood. Today, thousands of homes, major roads and vital infrastructure sit on that low ground behind the wall. It is prime, flat, developed land, and it is exactly the kind of place the maps of 2050 turn blue. And you don't have to go back 400 years to see it. Just inland from that same estuary lie the Somerset levels, another vast stretch of low, flat, drained land, much of it at or below sea level. In the winter of 2013 and 2014, after weeks of relentless rain, the levels simply drowned. The rivers overflowed, the drainage failed, and the water spread out across the land and stayed there for weeks. Whole villages were cut off, reachable only by boat. Homes and farms sat marooned in the middle of a vast inland sea. Livestock had to be evacuated. Families watched the brown water sit in their living rooms, day after day, unable to drain away. It was a slow, grinding disaster that played out on the national news for a month. a stark modern reminder of what happens to low-lying Britain when the water comes and has nowhere to go. And that was river and rainwater. The maps of 2050 add the rising sea on top of it. The threat runs all the way up Britain's coasts and rivers, through the industrial north and beyond. On the northeast coast, the city of Middlesbrough and the low-lying land around the River Tees are flagged as seriously exposed, with large areas projected to be at risk as the sea rises. In the northwest, parts of Liverpool and the towns strung along the Mersey estuary sit close to the water. Up in Scotland, low-lying parts of Glasgow along the River Clyde and stretches of Edinburgh's coastline appear on the risk maps too. And across the Irish Sea, the city of Belfast, much of it built on reclaimed low-lying land at the head of its lough, is considered one of the most flood-exposed cities on these islands. Everywhere you look around the edges of Britain, the same story repeats. Our cities were built where the land meets the water, for trade and for ports and for rivers. And now that the water is rising, that ancient advantage is turning into a modern danger. And that brings us, at last, to the greatest prize of all, and the most frightening story on this entire list. Because the sea is not only coming for the smaller cities and the flat coasts, it is coming for the capital, London. One of the greatest cities on earth, home to nearly 9 million people, the beating heart of the United Kingdom. And London has a secret that most of the millions who live there rarely think about. It is a city under threat from the sea. London sits on the tidal River Thames, around 50 miles from the open water. And the Thames is not a gentle inland river here. It rises and falls with the tide, and it is dangerously vulnerable to storm surges pushing up from the North Sea. If a great surge were ever to funnel up the Thames and meet a high tide and heavy river flow, the water could pour over the banks and into the heart of the city, into the underground tunnels, the power stations, the hospitals, the homes of hundreds of thousands of people. The scale of the potential disaster is almost unthinkable. Vast areas of central and east London, some of the most valuable land on the planet, sitting directly in the flood zone. For now, London is saved by a single remarkable piece of engineering, the Thames Barrier. Built across the river in the east of the city and completed in the 1980s, it is a line of great steel gates that normally lie flat on the riverbed, letting the ships pass. But that can be rotated up in a matter of minutes to form a solid steel wall against an incoming surge, sealing the tidal river off from the city behind it. For decades, it has held London safe. But here is the part that should worry everyone. When the Thames Barrier was first built, it was expected to be raised only a handful of times a year. In recent years, it has had to be closed far, far more often than that, a clear physical sign of a rising sea and a changing climate pressing harder and harder against the city's defences. The barrier was designed to protect London until around the 2070s. After that, it will no longer be enough. And so, right now, engineers are already planning what comes next. A bigger barrier, or a whole new line of defences. Because everyone involved understands one simple, sobering fact. The water is going to keep rising, and the current wall will not hold forever. And it is worth pausing to picture what is actually being protected here. Behind that steel wall lie hundreds of thousands of homes, the deepest tunnels of the London Underground, power stations and hospitals, the financial district, and some of the most valuable real estate on the entire planet. Well over £1 trillion of property and infrastructure, all sitting in the potential path of the water. This is why the Thames Barrier is closed more often with every passing decade, and why its successor is already on the drawing board. London will not be allowed to drown without a fight. The money and the will to defend the capital are simply too great. But that raises the hardest question of all, because defending London on that scale costs a fortune, and there is a limit to how much of the coastline the country can afford to wall off. Which places get the barriers, the pumps, and the billions? And which ones, quietly, do not? That is the truth that connects every city on this list. Hull below the waves, the drowned if the pumps stop Fens, island-bound Portsmouth, the great tide at Cardiff and Bristol, and London behind its ageing barrier. For 1,000 years we built our greatest cities on the water's edge, because the water was our highway, our defence, and our fortune. And now the water is coming to collect. None of these cities will vanish overnight. But the maps of 2050 are real, drawn by serious scientists, and they show a Britain where the sea has quietly reclaimed streets and districts and neighbourhoods that have been dry land for centuries. The question is no longer whether the water is rising. It is how high, how fast, and which of these places we will be able to save. And that is the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath all of this. Right now, something like 2.5 million properties in Britain are already at high risk of flooding from the sea or the rivers. And on current projections, that number is expected to climb toward well over 3 million by the middle of this century. 3 million homes and workplaces in the danger zone. There is not enough money in the country to build a wall around every single one of them. And so slowly and very quietly, the same painful process we've seen in Britain's disappearing villages is beginning to loom over its towns and cities too. Hard, cold decisions about which places will be defended at all costs and which will eventually have to be given up to the water. Insurance is already becoming harder and more expensive in the highest risk areas. Property values in some flood-prone streets are beginning to wobble. It is the very beginning of a reckoning that this century will be forced to have about how much of low-lying Britain we can actually keep. So the next time you stand on a seafront in one of these cities or cross a bridge over a tidal river in the middle of a town, take a good look at how close the water already is. And then imagine it just a little higher. Because that map, with all its patches of blue, is not a fantasy. It is a forecast, and the tide is already coming in. And now the question that's been hanging over this whole video: was your city one of them? If the place you live got a mention today, Hull, Portsmouth, Cardiff, Bristol, London, or anywhere on that flooding map, tell me in the comments below. I read them all, and I genuinely want to know how close the water is to you. If this opened your eyes the way it did ours, please subscribe. It truly helps us keep making these. And we'll see you on the next one, because the sea has taken British cities before. And unless something changes, the map of Britain that your grandchildren grow up with may not look like the one we know at all.